Welcome to Art Up Close at the BCMA. It's a series of short conversations aimed at connecting students with objects in the Museum of Art's permanent collection. My name is Elizabeth Humphrey, and I'm joined by my colleague, Sean Burrus. You'll see us both on the screen here. Our inaugural episode will focus on protest art and the Black Lives Matter movement by using and examining one work by Titus Kaphar to examine how it functions as a form of protest and activism. If you have any questions during or after the presentation, be sure to enter them in the Q&A section on Zoom. You can find that in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. We'll be answering a few of those questions after our short talk. So let's get started. So the work that you see in front of you is the Jerome Project, Asphalt and Chalk, number 11, done in 2015 by Titus Kaphar. I like to think that there's a haunting quality to the drawing in front of us. 3 pairs of eyes gaze back at the viewer, making it clear that there are 3 individual portraits layered together to make a composite portrait of 3 slain individuals. It is through the iconography, if you will, of the outline sketches that we come to recognize these 3 young men. Trayvon Martin, who was killed in 2012, Michael Brown, 2014, and Tamir Rice, also in 2014. The way that Titus Kaphar renders this drawing makes it difficult to focus on one individual. The overlapping and layered effect of these portraits perhaps suggests a shared experience of the subjects pictured. The meaning of the portraits are heightened due to the materials used in the drawing. As you can see on the screen, it's made of chalk and asphalt paper, which might bring to mind the drawings or outlines of victims' bodies at a crime scene that are done by the police in the aftermath of a killing. So using chalk to outline these people not only calls to mind effects of portraiture, but also what happens in the criminal justice system. The images that we have, or that Titus Kaphar used as source material for these portraits, are based on photographs that circulated widely in the aftermath of their killing. Some of the identifiable characteristics that might be seen in these 3 portraits are the graduation cap that Michael Brown was wearing in his photograph disseminated in the news, and of course, Trayvon Martin's iconic hoodie. Sean?
Absolutely. Thank you, Elizabeth. I want to share with you a little bit about how this drawing here in the Bowdoin collection relates to Titus's larger practice. Like many artists, Titus uses his studio and his practice to process his experience in the world around him. As he puts it, his studio is where he goes to wrestle with history. And his work, as a rule, has engaged very deeply with 2 themes. One of those themes is the history of Black representation in the arts, which he pointedly refers to as a history of Black representation enslaved, in servitude, and impoverished. In other words, the erasure and silencing of Black lives and Black history in art. The other major theme that Titus grapples with in his practice is a more contemporary issue of police brutality, mass incarceration, and racial injustices done to Black bodies and Black lives by the criminal justice system, which is similarly a story of erasure and silencing. The drawing that we have here at Bowdoin is part of a larger body of work called the Jerome Project, which deals with those themes, and which Titus explains as an investigation into the criminal justice system through the name Jerome. That project came about when Titus was searching for his biological father on Google, and he came across his father's mugshot. That wasn't a surprise to Titus. Titus knew that his father had been incarcerated multiple times during his life. But what was a surprise to Titus, what in fact scared Titus, was the fact that he found almost 100 other mugshots of Black men with the same first and last name as his father, Jerome. Titus collected these mugshots and he began painting them all. And this first phase of the project, the Jerome Project, illustrates two aspects of Titus's practice that Elizabeth has already referred to and that are readily apparent in the Bowdoin drawing as well. That is the use of layering techniques and the presence of multiple narratives. As you can see, after Titus painted the mugshots, he began dipping them in tar, layering the paintings with a substance that has very potent symbolic connotations. He originally dipped these paintings in tar based on an equation that was meant to represent how long an individual had spent their life incarcerated. But he quickly abandoned that equation as he came to realize that no equation could do justice with the long-lasting and lingering effects of incarceration on a life, from the loss of fundamental rights like voting to the difficulty of finding a job after incarceration, all of which are ways of continuing to erase and silence Black voices from our society. As a body of work, the multiple narratives of the Jerome Project tell a complex and common story about the toll of mass incarceration on the Black community. Just like the haunting drawing in the Bowdoin collection, which pictures Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and Tamir Rice, tells a terrible shared story of Black victims of police violence. Now, one last point that I want to make about the larger Jerome Project is that the form of these portraits are based on Byzantine icon paintings. Titus's father was named after the Saint Jerome, and that religious connection brought Titus to the genre of icon paintings, which are devotional objects that are usually gilded and present an idealized image of the subject that is meant to be worshipped. A very far cry and a stark contrast indeed from the mugshots that Titus was working from. And I think that this fits in with that other theme of Titus's work, that larger practice of questioning and correcting the history of Black representation in the arts. Like the chalk lines that recreate graduation photos on asphalt paper in the Bowdoin drawings, the mixing of genres here of mugshots and sacred images confronts us with a powerful question. Why do we idealize some lives and erase others? And what are we going to do about it? Elizabeth?
So in responding to Sean's question about the erasure of some lives and how we respond to that, we see that Titus Kaphar is in fact responding to that message, and that is how it folds into the Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter is not just an affirmation that those lives indeed matter, but making sure that it's a call to action that we take care of issues of racial profiling, policing, and lethal violence that proportionally largely affect the Black and Brown community. And so thinking about the criminal justice system and its impact on the Black community is one way that Titus Kaphar responds to this movement, responds to the issues that are taking place. And he does that artistically through not only his drawings, but his paintings. But the art is also a way for artists to shed light on these issues, but also cope with their grief and respond to these acts of violence. Titus Kaphar has mentioned in previous interviews that his focus has primarily been on Black men as victims of racial injustice and police brutality, but we also need to make sure that we acknowledge women's voices and insert their representation into this narrative as well. And that's where we turn to artists such as Jennifer Packer, who creates these very beautiful floral studies that are inspired by people she doesn't know. But as more police brutality occurred and the more media outcry of police violence towards Black women was made more visible, she realized that she was painting these flowers as sort of a commemorative portrait of those who were slain through the criminal justice system. And so this 2017 painting was painted after the tragedy of Sandra Bland as a way of coping. So not necessarily inserting a visual marker for Sandra Bland's portrait, but more so processing the artist's own grief and also prompting a response through the Say Her Name movement, where we are inserting more women's experiences in the Black Lives Matter movement at large. And so the painting here is aptly titled Say Her Name. Black Lives Matter is not exclusively about the issues of criminal justice, but dealing with encountering racial injustice and inserting representation at large. And so one thing to note is that artists in responding to the movement are taking a multiplicity of responses and techniques to reckon with the issues facing the Black community, and they're using their own artistic techniques to tackle the different nuances of what Black Lives Matter as a movement is doing. Sean?
Absolutely. So in our conversation, just by reflecting a little bit about what this work does on campus, and it does incredibly important work on campus. Let me start with that. It comes out dozens of times a semester for classes across the discipline, and it's one of our most consulted and viewed works. Elizabeth, you used two terms to speak about what artists were doing in conjunction with the Black Lives Matter that I think are important to highlight here. One is that they're processing, and the other is that they're prompting. And I think that is at the heart of what this work does for us here at Bowdoin. As I was reflecting on this, I was thinking about the ways we've engaged this in the classroom, and I'll outline a few. One of them is that it prompts us, or it confronts us with truths that about our society, difficult truths about our society that are right in front of our eyes, and that for some of us we've ignored far too long. It also creates a space for us as individuals and as a community to process those truths and to wrestle with our own complicity, our own role, our own responsibility, or our own relationship to those truths. So it creates that vital space for both individual and collective processing. The other third thing that it does, and I think this is really, really important, and I've witnessed this happen time and time again in the classroom, is that it's a very powerful way of opening up a critical dialogue about these pressing societal issues. It offers a starting point for having a conversation by injecting the perspective of an artist who's processing the same issues that we as individuals and we as a culture or society are processing. And as such, it really stimulates an incredibly important dialogue for the community at large, for the campus, and for individual classes at Bowdoin. Its scale and its immediacy, that haunting presence that you referred to, make it an inescapable reminder of truths that we need to be talking about, that we need to be analyzing, that we need to be taking a hard look at. And it's doing precisely that. And it's been doing that since it arrived on campus. And that's why we're excited to bring it here today and to open up a dialogue with you as well.
Great. Well, that concludes the portion of our talk where we are talking at you about the work itself, but now we want to open up the conversation and hear from our listeners today. And so if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll sort of moderate a discussion and answer your questions that way. And so as we wait for those, maybe one question to get us started and think about some of these questions is, Sean, I'll pose it to you. What is the role of art in creating change as we think about Titus Kaphar's work?
Absolutely. I think art is often, it serves as a couple of things. I think Titus himself would say that the first thing that he hopes his art does is create a conversation. And change doesn't happen without critical reflection and conversation. It just doesn't happen without us being honest with ourselves and each other and having the tough conversations that we all too often avoid for various reasons. Art like Titus's and this drawing by Titus is an incredibly powerful call to have that conversation, to confront us with the things we need to talk about. And that is one way it also serves as a reminder. Titus's larger practice is all about not just the contemporary issues of mass incarceration, police brutality, but it is also about the long history that precedes that. And it's reminding us of the complexities of that history and the dangers of ignoring that history as well, and the way that Black lives have been erased from the American story for far too long. And his work is very much about trying a starting point for fixing that narrative and rewriting that narrative in a way that does tell the whole truth.
Great. Well, we received one question. I'll read it aloud. How are Black women represented in art? Are they traditionally represented by metaphors like in the painting with the flowers, or as individuals in portraits like the Kaphar? And I'm happy to sort of take the first stab at that. Yes, you are correct in thinking that traditionally there is a paucity in some ways of Black women being depicted or represented in art, especially as we think about sort of activist art or protest art. We do often see that the conversation, the artistic conversation, does focus a lot more heavily on Black men and their experiences. We see this more generally in representational art as well, where the histories and legacies of African American men are put to the fore, and it is harder to sift out those representations of Black women in art. That is not to say that they do not exist. They are just a little harder to find, if you know where to look, they're easy to find. I will say that a lot of contemporary Black women artists are sort of taking that agency to themselves to insert those representational histories. So they are tackling some of these questions of representation, injustice, gender as well, gender equality. And so I think by looking to Black women artists, you can find a little bit more of that representation. Just to clarify, Jennifer Packer is a contemporary Black woman artist. And so that becomes sort of the center of her focus when she's working on these floral studies.
Absolutely. And, other names include Amy Sherrill as well. And I think it's also a good point that you've already alluded to, that Titus has indicated his awareness of his sort of focus on the lives of Black men. And that he has begun to, in some ways, maybe wrestle with the other side of that story as well, and the toll on Black women of these different forms of systemic racism. And so, I would note his most recent Time magazine cover, which just came out in the past few weeks. But I would also point out that that larger project that Titus is engaged in terms of representing or representing Black figures throughout history, has engaged in some ways with the representation of Black women. One of his most famous paintings is a portrait of Thomas Jefferson, where the canvas has been sort of ripped away, and you can see behind Thomas Jefferson a portrait of Sally Hemings. And I was watching a video of Titus speak about this piece, and it was actually really interesting to me. And this goes to a larger theme about Titus's art and back to the question of protest art, because he was asked why he made Sally Hemings' skin color so dark in the painting, because based on what we know, we have no images. First of all, this goes to Titus's larger comment or commentary on the fact of the erasure of Black lives. We have no images or portraits of Sally Heming. We have a description of her that indicates that she had fairly light skin color and was of a mixed European and African ancestry. And so an audience member asked Titus why he decided in this painting that is very, one of his most famous, why he decided to paint Sally Hemings with such a dark skin color. And he said because he wanted it to be obvious what he was doing. He didn't want anyone to be able to avoid the point that he was making about the erasure of Black lives. And I think that goes to one of the strengths of his work as protest art, is that it is hitting us in the face at times with things that should be obvious but are not always, and that we need to notice.
Yeah. One question we have is, how does this piece fit into the context of other works in the museum's collection? Are there other specific pieces you would suggest we also check out that relate to this theme or Titus Kaphar's work? I can start that. I think there are two different themes that come to mind when you're studying Titus Kaphar's work. One is the idea of what other works connect to racial injustice, and then other works that connect to protest art more generally. And I think if we're looking for art in the collection that connects to racial injustice or issues of historic representation, there are a couple of works I can think of. One is an artist book by Kara Walker in the collection. It's called Freedom, a Fable, the tale of a negress. And so, yes, it's a very outdated word, negress, but I think the work that piece does to sort of examine what happened in slavery to fleeing back to Africa is an interesting moment in history for Kara Walker to unpack. We also have Glenn Ligon's Runaway series, where he is inviting people in his circle to identify him, his characteristics, and then juxtaposing that with images from runaway ads. And then we have Carrie Mae Weems's American Icon series with a Mammy and Sambo pepper and salt shaker. And I think that gets at the legacy of racism in this country. Sean, do you want to maybe talk about the protest pieces that we have?
Absolutely. When we think more largely about, or more broadly about protest art, there is a long history of art that either captures protest movements or is deeply engaged and embedded in the act of protest. And I would put just a few names on the table from our own collection. The first of these are a pair of portraits that actually often are in the same classroom with Titus Kaphar's work, and those are by the Iranian artist Shirin Neshat, who during the Arab Spring in Egypt and the events of Tahrir Square traveled around making a documentary, and these photographs came out of that process, and they are very similarly haunting photographs of a large size, and they have such presence, and they capture two individuals, Gotti and I'm dropping the name of one right now, but their eyes are just follow you around the room and call you to attention, to wrestle with the loss and the struggle and the pain that they as individuals, as Egyptian individuals during the events of Tahrir Square were experiencing as their society was in the midst of a protest generating great upheaval. Another name and another artist who we have a large body of work from is Akra Shep. Akra Shep did a really fascinating series of photographs around the Occupy Wall Street movement that were actually on display simultaneously. This was a way in which he was not only capturing a protest movement, but he was engaged in a form of protest himself, I think. He was going to the Occupy Wall Street movement in New York every single day and capturing a new series of portraits of individuals who were engaged in one form or another with the protests, whether they were bystanders, viewers, participants, people who were actually occupying the square. And then he was going back to his studio and printing those on a daily basis. And every day at the gallery that was hosting his work, there was a new rotation of photographs that were coming in a way hot off the press from the Occupy Wall Street movement. And the museum has a fairly substantial collection of those portraits as well, which includes some really remarkable and powerful images of people in the midst of protest in our own country. That's two that I would give off, but we do have a number of other artists who've engaged in protests or whose art has documented protests. Ginny Holzer and Danny Lyon are two other names that come to mind.
Great. How do you feel about taking one more question, Sean?
I think we could take one more question. Do you want me to read this question?
Sure.
How would you define the role of portraiture specifically in these pieces? Kaphar is depicting actual faces, but Packer is depicting flowers as a representation of Sandra Bland and others.
Yeah. So I think I can't help but think about our previous exhibition a couple of years ago, This Is a Portrait If I Say So, that examined different interpretations of what portraiture could be. And I think in this case, portraiture could be more on the representational side, where you are quite literally depicting images of people. But I think portraiture also can function as a way of representing the idea of a person. And so that's how I reconcile the more overt expression of portraiture in Titus Kaphar's work, where we see Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, and Trayvon Martin depicted in very detailed sketches. Even if it's hard to read their three faces separately, they're all three physically present. But I see the sort of portrait of Sandra Bland as also functioning as a portrait. I think it is a representative portrait of everyone that is impacted by the Say Her Name movement. So representation of all of the women who have been impacted by the criminal justice system or police brutality, and sort of functions as a representative portrait, even if their names or their faces are not invoked.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that contrast, what on the surface of it looks like a real contrast between these two works. But when we really drill down, I think you've already pointed out some of the ways in which Titus's portraits don't always resolve into individual portraits, right? The features present this double or triple vision, and it is hard to see the individual for the multiplicity, through the layering and the multiplicity of narratives. And the same is true of that larger Jerome Project and the series of paintings layered in tar that he did. The only thing I would add is that one of the interesting things about the tar that it would cover every individual, at least up to the point of their face, of their mouth, was in some ways was twofold for Titus, the point of that. One was it was representing the silencing of the individual. But he's also pointed out that in some ways, the covering in tar is granting a sort of privacy to the individual and granting back some agency and humanity that is denied in the genre of mugshots, which are public. And that's how we found all of these, because they're a matter of public record. And these incarcerated individuals were denied their privacy in that way. And so it's interesting to think about the way that Titus's own act of erasure or obscuring a portrait and refusing to allow it to function as a typical portrait in which all the individual features of someone are immediately recognizable is in its own way sort of a metaphor, or much like Jennifer Packer's work.
Great. Well, Sean, thank you for sharing this dialogue with me, and thank you to our viewers for participating and asking some really great questions. I just want to put a plug in that we will have more upcoming episodes for this series of short conversations throughout the semester. So be on the lookout through Instagram and campus groups to hear more about those. The next one should be September 30th, but we look forward to seeing and speaking with you then. So thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.